Critical Role's new D&D competitor, Daggerheart, comes out very soon, and I wanted to talk about some of the biggest differences between the two, since both are fantasy collaborative storytelling TTRPGs. What makes Daggerheart stand out? And there's a bunch of smaller differences like the naming of things or the way some systems work, but it plays very similarly to D&D. Things like that I will talk more about in my big Daggerheart review coming out later this month, but this video is about differences that will affect gameplay and make Daggerheart feel more like Daggerheart. I should also say this is based on beta material and things may be different in the finished game. Instead of rolling a d20 then adding your modifier to that when you want to do a check, you roll 2 d12s and add them together, then add your modifier to that. This determines if you succeed or fail. I think rolling 2 dice is always more fun than rolling 1, but this means that if you are rolling with advantage or disadvantage, rather than rolling 4 d12s, you just roll an extra d6, which you either add to the roll for advantage or subtracts for disadvantage. Directly connected to that, each duality dice is different. One is a hope dice and one is a fear dice. So it helps if they're different colours, so you know which is which. When you roll a check, you have to figure out if you succeed or not. You also need to tell the GM which dice rolled higher, the hope or the fear dice. For example, if I roll a 5 and a 7 on the dice and have no modifiers, I add them up to 12, and if the hope dice rolled higher, I would say I rolled a 12 with hope. If the fear dice rolled higher, I would say I rolled a 12 with fear. Whenever the player rolls with hope, they get a hope resource which they can use in the future. Whenever they roll with fear, the GM gets a fear resource which they can use in the future. But we will get into that in a second. Having this 2 dice system means that rather than D&D, which only has 2 outcomes from a dice roll, success or failure, Daggerheart has 4 outcomes. A success with hope, a success with fear, a failure with hope, and a failure with fear. So as well as each roll giving a resource to either the player or the DM, this also has narrative consequences. A success always means a success at what the player is trying to accomplish, but a success with hope means it all went swimmingly, and a success with fear means the DM can, if they want to, add an additional complication and consequences to the roll. For example, a player is trying to pick a lock. If they succeed with hope, the door unlocks and the players move into an empty room without anyone seeing. A success with fear, the players unlock the door and maybe the players enter the room to find a guard inside. A failure with hope means the player fails at what they want to do, but it's not too bad, and a failure with fear means they fail and it's pretty bad. For example, a failure with hope means a player trying to lockpick the door fails at lockpicking it, and the players have to find another way into the room. A failure with fear means the players fail at picking the lock and are spotted by a guard who begins to chase them. This system means that every dice roll has more potential to take the story in different directions, but it also means the GM has to think more about the potential outcomes of every roll. And this is the first big difference between Daggerheart and D&D. If a GM wants just a simpler, more binary system, D&D is probably better for them. But if they want a system with more consequences to dice rolls and more narrative randomness, then Daggerheart is for them. It's also a lot harder to railroad in Daggerheart because every roll has potentially 4 outcomes instead of 2, and the story could fly off in unpredictable directions. I also think this kind of makes Daggerheart better for GMs who like to improvise on the fly more, than GMs who like to know roughly exactly how the session is going to unfold. So like I said, rolling with hope and rolling with fear either gives the player a hope resource or the GM a fear resource. Hope resources can be used by players to activate certain abilities or do certain things in game. They are pretty much focus points that monks have or sorcery points that sorcerers have in D&D, but for all classes. If you are a player and you want to be doing lots of cool stuff often, you want to be rolling with hope and collecting these hope points. They are pretty much player ammunition or like ultimate charge for the gamers out there, so you can just press Q to ult. The fear resource is the same kind of thing for the GM. The GM collects fear points every time the players roll with fear, and the GM can use this fear to do things in combat or throw random complications into the story for players. This means that the players are constantly collecting resources they can use, and the GM is also held accountable for being a jerk. If you want the bad guy to use a legendary action, you better have the fear resource to do it. You want a guard to walk around a corner randomly before the players get a chance to unlock a door, you can do it, but it will cost a fear token. There's also a transparency here that I like. When something happens in a game the players maybe don't like, they get to see the GM use a fear token. They physically move the token and say what they're going to do, so the players know the GM paid a price to do that thing. And also they know it's a limited resource that's used for other things, so the GM can't do things like this often. It also, and I think this is important, makes the game feel more like a game for the GM. It is a resource management game, and the GM is constantly collecting points and spending points. It means the GM is not in God mode like they are in D&D, where what they say just happens. The GM in Daggerheart can do whatever they want, but they are limited by how often they can do it because of this fear resource. So this is a huge difference between D&D and Daggerheart, but I should say, GMs who want to play Daggerheart more like D&D with less focus on fear points can just do that. Super quick one here. Critical successes and rolls in D&D are when you roll a 20 on the d20, but in Daggerheart, it's when you roll the same number on both d12s. This video is sponsored by Describe, a powerful resource for game masters, no matter what system you're running. Whether you're prepping for Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, Daggerheart, or any other fantasy TTRPG, Describe gives you access to thousands of richly written descriptions for characters, locations, monsters, items. I mean, you name it, they've got it. These aren't generic blurbs either, they're vivid, immersive, and system agnostic, so you can drop them right into your world with zero hassle. Plus, Describe includes maps, ambient sound, and music to enhance the vibe at your table or virtual game. It's a serious time saver and a creativity booster. Check out Describe using the link below, and huge thanks to them for supporting this video. And another quick one is Daggerheart's focus on narrative. With the duality dice and hope and fear resources, the players and the GM are constantly tugging and pulling the story in different directions. This can happen in D&D too, but to me D&D feels more like the GM is telling the story and the players get to manipulate it slightly from the inside. But Daggerheart feels more like the GM and the players are telling a story together, and each session is going to be a lot more unpredictable, for better or worse. For me as a GM, I like starting at point A and having no idea where we're all going to end up. I get to go on a journey with the players. But for others, they may want to know roughly what's going on and what's going to happen from one scene to the next. That being said, I won't really know how this all is going to play out till I get to run a long-term campaign in Daggerheart. This focus on narrative may be much less of a deal, and these two games overall could end up running very similarly narratively, especially taking into account different GM styles. So take this one in particular with a grain of salt. This one feels like a big difference on paper, but I think once we get to play with it a few times, it's going to normalize itself pretty fast. In D&D, you roll initiative at the start of combat and then take turns going in order. GMs are the most on during combat, and for me, it's the most exhausting and stressful part of D&D. And it still always feels like it takes longer than it should. Having no initiative means you don't stop the game and play a different turn-based game during combat. You just continue how you have been, asking the table who wants to go first and then asking who wants to go next. Now the issue here is that louder and more decisive players may try to go multiple times before the quieter and more indecisive players. They did have a system where players throw a token into the center once they have been, and the player can't go again until all the tokens are in the center, including the GMs, but it's all a little messy. However, it's what the game outside of combat is, both for D&D and Daggerheart, and it works there. Players don't take it in initiative turns to talk to an NPC, or get drinks at the tavern, or explore a room, and if they did, things would take forever. It would also make players think they have to do something when they really don't. I think in a perfect world, this should be the same for combat, and most of the issues with this stem from the players being a little competitive with each other during combat. They want to show off and do cool things in front of the other players. They want to roll really high damage numbers, they want to get the final blow. So if it feels like they're missing their turns, or someone else is getting more turns than them, it feels like they're being cheated. I think what Daggerheart is setting out to do is make combat less like combat and more like the collaborative storytelling that happens outside of combat. Players should be helping each other do cool stuff. They should be giving the final blow to a player who does not get to do final blows often. They should be teaming up with each other and doing combo attacks. And yes, Daggerheart allows that. And it may take players a little bit of time to get out of the D&D combat mindset, but if they can learn not to be as competitive and to work together in combat, I think Daggerheart combat could become incredibly quick and fluid. That being said, there are already alternative ways to run combat with more order without rolling initiative. My favourite being just going around a table in order as people are sat. In Daggerheart, characters have much less hit points than D&D, but damage done does not equate HP lost. In fact, Daggerheart has a damage threshold system. If a baddie does say 6 damage, the player can look at the character sheet, see a simple conversion table, and know that between 1 and 8 damage is known as minor damage, and is only worth 1 hit point. If the baddie rolled a 10, that would be major damage, and they would mark 2 HP. And if the baddie did over 16 damage, that would be severe damage, and they would take 3 HP. This system is very different from D&D, and on the surface feels way more complex, but a player's character sheet tells them exactly what each damage threshold is, so once they get their head around it, it makes the maths a lot easier, and it's nicer not to play with characters who just have crazy high HP, where the numbers kind of don't mean anything anymore. Characters also have armor slots, meaning when they get hit, they can use this limited resource to knock a damage threshold down by 1. So if they get hit by major damage and use an armor slot, it knocks it down to minor damage. This means the way players build their characters and the gear they use gives them extra chances to take less damage if they play strategically. Stress is fun for me. It's another resource like HP or armor slots. Players have so many stress slots, but it's hit points of the mind. It represents mental trauma. A player may try to do something in-game that would seriously affect them mentally or emotionally. Some characters have abilities that need to use stress points to work, and if you use up all your stress slots, you lose 1 HP. This system is kind of the equivalent of exhaustion in D&D that barely anyone uses, but it's being built up in Daggerheart to be used a lot. What happens if you don't eat or sleep for days, or you see a friend being brutally murdered in front of you? Well, you'd probably take stress points, and if you take enough of them, your body starts to take physical damage. Super quick one. But Daggerheart's species are known as ancestries, and the ones you'll find in the DH core rulebook are very different from the D&D one, and yes, I'm trying to make DH a thing. For example, you will see characters like dwarves, elves, and humans in DH just like you do in D&D, but also things like clanks, fairies, and ribbits. These are similar to species found in D&D in expanded books, but in DH, these are core ancestries that speak to the kind of world DH wants to be. Obviously, you can set your games in any world you want, but without banning ancestries from the core rulebook, you'll have to account for there being robot, mushroom, and giant turtle people running around your world. First off, there are only 10 levels in Daggerheart, which is pretty much how most people play D&D anyway, but it means that hopefully in Daggerheart, level progression is more impactful. 1 level in Daggerheart potentially equals 2 levels in D&D. Now obviously, I'm sure Daggerheart will be balanced to make sure the power jumps are not too much, but also 10 levels is just easier to balance in general than the 20 levels in D&D. And we won't know till we play it, but I think in general, Daggerheart's ancestries and classes will feel more balanced with each other and all be equally fun to play because they just don't have to account for as much level variety. Though obviously there's a downside to this, as maybe some players want more than 10 levels. Daggerheart is new, D&D is old, and this makes for some huge differences of how easy it's going to be to interact with this game. For example, if I want to Google how surprise works or how grappling works in D&D, I'm going to get a ton of different hits, talking about homebrew, talking about the 2014 rules, and talking about the 2024 rules. Not to mention all the older editions of D&D and 50 years of history. The name of the latest D&D rule set is confusing to say the least, 2024 5th edition, and the whole thing is just a little messy. It's been one of the biggest issues I've had with D&D 5e the past few years. Daggerheart does not have this issue. It is shiny and it's new. Things will be clear, easy to search, and because of this, I think learning Daggerheart is going to be relatively easy. On the flip side, however, I also have a ton of resources for D&D, modules, settings, and homebrew content. Daggerheart does not have any of this yet, and I think it's still going to be easier to get casuals to play D&D over Daggerheart due to brand recognition, but yeah, that's the end of the video. Subscribe.